When we're building things in CDK, it can be really easy to get carried away with the L2 and L3 construct abstractions and kind of forget that behind the scenes there's some CloudFormation going on. But if you want to really CDK, it can be really easy to forget that there's that much CloudFormation going on under the hood, because we have all these really lovely abstractions for creating resources and tying them together, especially if you're working in a team context where a lot of the heavy lifting might have been done by another developer or another builder or similar in the past. And you might just be given an L2 or L3 construct and it does all the tricky stuff. And that's awesome. But sometimes things go wrong, or sometimes we have to do things that aren't immediately available through a nice interface like an L2 or L3 construct. And so we've got to remember that there is CloudFormation happening under the hood, and we've got to understand what CloudFormation is being created, what CloudFormation resources, I should say, are being created for the things we've got in CDK. So we've done a deployment pretty recently, and none of the code has changed since we did that deployment. So if I open up the cdk.out directory, which is generated, there are two files here that are of interest to us. One is the gettingstartedstack.assets.json, and one is the gettingstartedstack.template.json. Let's start with assets. So you can see here in this files section of the assets, we've got one asset here called gettingstartedstack.template.json. It's a file and it tells you where it's been put. So there's a assets bucket here and it's got the account ID and region that we're currently in. There's the templates, and then we've got a key for that, and we've got a role used for it. So let's go into our account here that we've been using for this demo, and let's pop to, sorry, let me zoom in a second there. Let's pop to S3. You can see we've only got one bucket, but that does follow the convention that we've got there for this destination for our asset. And we click on that, and lo and behold, there is a file with exactly the same name as the one we've got in the object key. So this is our uploaded template, if you like, because when CDK is deploying our code, when it's making CloudFormation do the work, it will upload the CloudFormation template. In this case, it's JSON. Obviously, CloudFormation supports YAML as well. And then it will tell CloudFormation to create a change set using this file. So we could download this if we wanted to, but actually there's the same template here in the local CDK.out directory. So if we open this up, then this is the CloudFormation template that's been used to build the resources that we've got in our Getting Started stack. So we've only got two things here. We've got a queue and a topic, and then we've got some stuff to wire the two together to create a subscription on the topic that sends messages into our queue. So let's see what's actually been created to facilitate that. So I'm gonna fold these down as we go because it's quite a verbose file. But we're going to look at the type field here, which is the CloudFormation resource type. So we've got an SQS queue. Let's close that. We've got a queue policy. So we mentioned earlier that when we ran a deploy, CDK was asking us about the IAM permissions, but we said, well, we haven't written any policies. We've not written any IAM related stuff. So why is it doing that? Well, it's doing that because the subscription of the queue to the topic requires some IAM. It requires a queue policy. And so it's produced this policy for us, this whole document here. We didn't have to do this. But that means that we've got to get it into AWS. We've got to create it. And that is achieved using CloudFormation. So we have an AWS SQS queue policy resource. Then we've got the subscription itself. So we've got nice things linking together. So here's your topic ARN. There's the endpoint, which is going to be the queue ARN. Next up, we have the topic itself. And then we've got a CDK metadata resource, which we don't really have to worry about. I don't think in day-to-day usage you need to bother with the CDK metadata resource or what it's doing. And then that's it for the resources. There's some conditions and other bits and pieces. There's a parameter in to check the version of the bootstrap that you want to look up. That's coming from that SSM parameter, sorry. And then there's some rules about checking the bootstrap version, but we don't need to worry about those. So from these three sections here, I know it's put over more than 3 lines, but almost these 3 lines of CDK code, we've got a number of these resources. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to map the mental model, if you like, between the CDK stuff and the CloudFormation that lies beneath. If I go to one of these level 2 constructs like the queue and I click into that, I'm getting put into the types in WebStorm. I can click on the little target button here. It's very similar things in other editors, and we go to Queue.js. You might be thinking, well, that's not great. That's not very useful. It's all minified. And sometimes if I'm doing a lot of analysis into a particular construct that's built in, and I really need to understand exactly what's going on, I'll view the CDK source code in GitHub instead. Obviously, you can check it out if you'd prefer. You can have your own copy, but it's quite a large project, and you'd have to keep it up to date pretty frequently. So I'm just going to switch to the main branch, and we can look at this construct here in the source code. So you can see we're exporting a load of things from various files, including queue. So let's see what is in queue. And then here's a properties interface, and we should have the queue construct. When I've got through all these, here we go. Here's your queue class, here's your queue construct. So there's a number of methods here. Let's start with the constructor, because that's what we're calling. And that is doing some validation. We would assume that from a method name. It's got some bits and pieces to do with a dead letter queue, if you want to use a dead letter queue, some configuration for encryption. And then here, actually really interestingly, on 9.366, we start creating a CloudFormation resource. So this is the AWS : SQS : queue resource that we saw in the template. And that's getting a number of properties passed in, some from the constructor arguments, some from things that it's calculating based on whether you've perhaps got FIFO enabled, whether you've got encryption set up, or what kind of encryption you've got set up, and so on and so forth. Same for dead letter queues or redriving. And then we do some bits and pieces to wire together some attributes and go through various different scenarios for the encryption stuff and FIFO and various other things. So if you were trying to work out what you're getting when you create a level 2 construct queue, actually there's a bit of figuring out there. There's a bit of thinking about what the construct's doing, what path you're going through the construct. So it could be a little bit fiddly trying to understand that, trying to map between the CDK world and the CloudFormation world. But we can always really easily view the end result once it's all been done, either by looking for the template in cdk.out when we've done the deployment, or by looking at the results of running CDK synth. So you might remember earlier in a previous lesson we set up the package script for CDK synthing called synth. So let's do an npm run synth, and we're going to redirect that into a file called template. It's going to be YAML, isn't it? Yeah, template.yaml. So let's open up template.yaml. You can see we've got a bit of stuff at the start here from npm having been run, so let's cut that off there. And then we've got the YAML equivalent of the template that we've just looked at in JSON in the cdk.out. And that gives us the same thing. And we can run this over and over and over again without changing any of the running infrastructure, without doing anything in AWS, just to see what's happening, just to see if the right settings are being translated through into CloudFormation. So how do you know what the right settings are? Well, luckily, there's a documentation page, which I'm going to link in the notes of this lesson, that tells you everything going on in CloudFormation, gives a complete reference of all the resources. And there are tons of resources. So we could find SQS here. Where are we? Simple. So many simples. Do you know what? Oh, there it is. Gone right past it. And you can see there are 2 resource types for SQS, and it turns out we're actually using both in our example. Let's have a look at queue, and then we can have a look at all of these properties, and there's a very handy piece of functionality where we can click on it, and it takes us to the description here about whether we have to pass it in or not, the type it should be, and then what it is. And sometimes these are more or less useful depending on the resource. You might get to a particular description and think, that description's almost just a copy of the name of this property. What does it do? And in that case, sometimes it can help to look for the API for the service you're using. So for example, for the simple queue service, we have actions inside of the API reference here, and one of them is going to be create queue. There it is. And then create queue is going to have very similar attributes or properties to what's in CloudFormation. They're normally mostly the same. So we've got delay seconds here, and if we look for delay seconds back in CloudFormation, whoops, then we've got the same property name. And sometimes the descriptions are very similar, sometimes they're the same, sometimes there'll be more detail in one or the other. So if you ever are stuck with what's in the CloudFormation documentation or CloudFormation reference, you can always go and have a look at the create and update API reference for your given service. So in this case, create queue is going to be used because we are making a queue. And the names aren't always quite identical, but you'll be able to work it out. You'll be able to match the two up. So another thing we could talk about then, while we're on the topic of CloudFormation and CDK and synthesizing or synthing, is how we actually arrive at this CloudFormation based on what's in CDK. So we've got some IDs here. These are logical IDs, not necessarily the name that would end up in AWS or the resource. And we've got what looks very similar to the logical ID we passed into the construct here when we initialized it. And then we've got some weird looking thing at the end. And if you were really, really eagle-eyed, you may have seen me on an MD5 service earlier. And that's because the hash that's at the end of the file name there is an MD5 hash of this CDK path. So let's pop over to the MD5 hash generator. Let's generate that. And oops, I don't think I was supposed to put resource at the end. Worth us discussing is how we arrive at these logical IDs here that you can see in CloudFormation. So these are based on the path that particular resource. So when we start looking at making our own constructs and when we start nesting constructs together, you'll see that these resource names get a little bit more complicated, a little bit more involved. So you can see, for example, the getting started queue here has a policy within it. And so that name's been formed by just putting the two together. But if you get longer names or if you get more nesting, it gets a little bit trickier. And you can see we've also got a hash at the end. And that hash is based on the getting started queue / resource here. It's actually an MD5 hash of this string. And only the first part of the hash is taken. That's why it's not the full length of an MD5 hash. So these are created here, these are put into CDK by a synthesizer. Put into CloudFormation template by a synthesizer. That's why we talk about synth or synthesizing, because we have a synthesizer behind the scenes that's doing it. And there are some choices of synthesizers, but you're probably going to use the default one in most use cases. There's one here called bootstrapless synthesizer, and as the name would suggest, you don't have to do an npm run bootstrap first. But with the bootstrapless synthesizer, you can't use assets. So, for example, the lambda, function might have a zip file of code. It might have a Docker image. You might have a containerized service with a Docker image. All of those things don't work with the bootstrapless synthesizer. There's also one that doesn't assume roles for various operations. So I think you may remember very early on in the course we talked about the error message we saw when we tried to do a deploy without bootstrapping, and it talked about not being able to assume a role. And that's because it does use roles by default, but you can avoid that if you want. You can just use whatever credentials you've got running on the CLI. And then there's the default one that we've been using for the whole project so far, and is likely to be the one that we will be using for the foreseeable, just the default one. So I just want to make you aware that there are different synthesizers around. You can find them in the CDK code base at this path if you want to have a look. We're just going to use the default. The one final note is what happens if you want to go the other way. If you've got something in AWS and you want to trace it back to CDK, you want to understand why it exists. So the easiest way to do that is if the resource you're looking at has tags. So you can see I'm on the topic here that was created as part of our testing. You can see get started stack there, getting started topic. And if we look at the tags here, you can actually see the logical ID. And now in the case of this resource, the logical ID is present in the name as well, but we won't necessarily have an auto-generated name. We might not choose to have one, or it might be too long. The path to this resource might be such that we can't actually see the full value. We can have a look at the tags. We could have a look at the stack here. So this would let us find it in CloudFormation. We could go and find the logical ID, look at that in the template. And then here we go. Here's the topic. And then you can see that the metadata for that, which is just here. Sorry, it's a little bit slim there as a resource. Shows exactly where it came from. So the getting started stack, then a construct called getting started topic, and then the logical ID as resource. So we could look at this path here, which may be nested much more than this, may have various other constructs and bits involved, and then work out where in the CDK this particular resource that we found in AWS came from. I will give you one little note here, one little gotcha, in that if we go and look at the queue that was created as part of this testing, there aren't actually tags on the queue. And you might be thinking, why on earth are there no tags on the queue? If we look at the properties for the CloudFormation resource, you'll see that there are tags. That is a property there. And if we go and have a look at the queue resource itself, AWS SQS queue, there are no there are no tags in the properties. So why does the topic, which doesn't have any tags specified, in fact it's got no properties at all, get some of those tags, but the queue doesn't get those tags? That's because the SQS queue resource doesn't support getting the auto-generated tags, if you like, the logical ID, the stack ARN, and that's actually a bug in CloudFormation. And if you look at the CloudFormation GitHub repo, it is tracked there, but it's just one of those things to be aware of, that there are some little gotchas and edge cases and bits in CloudFormation that that we are impacted by as a result of using CDK.